Hi, I'm Jasma. Today we are making a cheesy pesto bread wreath. It's naturally colored, the design is actually very simple to create, and it makes for a perfect eye-catching piece for a holiday party. Now this bread uses a Tangzhong base. If you've never worked with Tangzhong before in bread, we're basically making a water roux, or kind of like a slurry, and we're cooking flour with water in a small saucepan on medium-high heat until it starts to thicken and bubble on the bottom. Make sure you keep whisking the entire time and scraping down the sides and the bottom occasionally so that nothing burns. Once this is ready, I'm transferring it into a clean bowl and letting it cool. When covering with a sheet of plastic wrap, be sure that it's touching the surface of the paste so it doesn't dry out and form a skin. Moving on, I have my fresh kale here, and this is what's going to color the bread naturally, but I promise you do not taste the kale at all. You can also use spinach or any dark green vegetable. So I have my blender here. I'm gonna add the kale in. Then for the water to help juice the kale, I'm using warm water because we need a little bit of heat later when we make the dough. So I just like to heat it up here to prevent cooking the kale if we heat it up all together later. The more water you add to this, the more diluted the color will be. So you want to add just enough for the blender to be able to turn this into a juice. I'm not straining this mixture because I feel like that's quite a waste of kale. So you want to blend this until you can no longer see the fibers of the kale leaves. This way it'll mix really smoothly into the rest of the dough. We're only using half a cup, which is 100 grams of this juice. So if you do have any leftovers, you can freeze it into ice cubes or blend it into smoothies. And now to put the dough together, I'm using a stand mixer with a hook attachment. And to the bowl, I'm gonna add all of the ingredients except for the salt. Add the kale juice to the all-purpose flour, crack in 1 whole egg. The Tangzhong is good to use as long as it's not still hot. It's fine if it's still a little warm. And also add your olive oil. The yeast I'm using is instant yeast, which means that I don't need to dissolve it before adding it into the dough, but it does require a little bit of heat, which is why I'm using some warm water in the kale mixture, and the Tangzhong is also still slightly warm, so that adds the necessary warmth needed for my instant yeast to work. Begin kneading on low speed, and this will look quite dry at first, just be patient with it. And about halfway through mixing, you can stop the mixer and add in the salt. This way we don't risk the salt coming in direct contact with our yeast. It will take a while for this dough to come together, so it will look a bit dry at first. Don't add any extra water to it though until it becomes a smooth ball like this and it detaches from the sides of the bowl and the hook. It shouldn't stick to your hands at all, and it should be pretty smooth overall. It took me about 10 to 15 minutes to get to this stage on medium-low speed. If you're kneading this by hand, it will most likely take a bit longer. To prepare for the proofing stage, grease a large bowl with some non-stick cooking spray. This prevents the dough from sticking and also from drying out. This is going to rise for at least 1 hour until it has doubled in size. Now, depending on the temperature of your room, the time may vary. So during the winter time when it's a bit colder, I like to help it out by preheating my oven to the lowest setting. So for my oven, it's 150 degrees Fahrenheit. I let that preheat until the oven is a bit warm. Then I keep the dough covered and inside the oven for the entire time it takes with the heat off. It's very important. You don't want to cook the dough while it's rising. And then just check on it occasionally. To give the bread its wreath shape, we're essentially creating a large donut. The simple way to go is to use an angel food cake pan, which kind of has this like funnel in the middle. But what I like to do is to use an adjustable cake ring mold with a smaller ring mold in the middle. It does the same thing, but I think it's a lot easier to work with because you are able to detach it completely, and it also has a lower chance of the bread sticking to everything. In the end, it's a lot easier to remove, but either one is going to work perfectly. If you don't have either of these, what you can do is to just use a regular 8-inch cake pan, preferably with a springform removable bottom, just so nothing sticks. If you do it like that, it's likely that it's not going to have the hole in the center because the bread will most likely, as it's rising and baking, kind of just stick together, but it'll still taste exactly the same. Before we can shape the bread, we need to make the filling. I like to freshly grate my own mozzarella cheese. I think it melts and just tastes better this way. And I'm mixing it with some basil pesto. And you can make this yourself, but even I don't have time for that during the holiday season, so I just get mine pre-made from Costco. The dough has risen. You can see it's nice and puffy and doubled in size. So now we can shape the bread. Lightly dust your work surface with all-purpose flour so nothing sticks to it. And roll into a large rectangle. You want the width of this rectangle to be a little less than the circumference of your desired wreath. I'm making 8-inch wreath and I rolled mine out to be 21 inches. Then using a pizza roller, divide the dough into 3 sections and create stripes along the top half of each piece of dough. This is what's going to create the textured pattern on the outside of your bread. Once complete, spread on the cheese and pesto mixture onto the uncut parts of the dough, and you must spread this out until it's flattened, but leave a little bit of space along the edges of each piece of dough. Use your rolling pin to press together the ends of the stripes that you made so that they're all attached. And now you can roll up each section of dough. Make sure you roll it as tightly as possible so you don't end up with a gap in the middle of your bread, and also so the filling doesn't spill out while it's rising and baking. Transfer each roll into a greased ring mold or cake pan and try and connect each section as seamlessly as possible. And if you're using my method, don't forget to put the greased smaller ring mold in the center. I'm covering this again so it doesn't dry out while it's rising for its second time. Again, it's going to take about an hour or so. Just keep an eye on it until it has doubled in size. This is done rising, so it's ready to be baked. I have my oven preheating to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And for an optional but recommended step, brush the surface of the dough with some egg whites and garnish with fresh rosemary and thyme, as well as some coarse sea salt. To prevent the top of this bread from browning, which is a rare ask for bread because I love a good crust, but for this one I want to maintain the vibrant green color of the dough. So I'm wrapping it tightly with foil, and this is going to remain covered for the entire 40 minutes. It needs to bake in the preheated 350 degrees oven. And to test if it's done, you just want to insert a knife into the center of the bread. It might have some cheese or pesto sticking to it, but there shouldn't be any wet or sticky dough. Let the bread cool before removing it from the pan. It should be pretty easy to release if you greased it well enough, but you can also use the help of a butter knife. This bread is best eaten warm so that the cheese inside is nice and melted, but if you're unable to serve it fresh, you can just reheat it by covering it with foil and popping it in the oven for a little bit. Hope you enjoyed this bread and stay tuned for more holiday recipes.